Hello, welcome to this module on social aspects in sustainability. My name is Julieta Díez Hernández, and I am a researcher at the Business and Economics Department in the University of Burgos. Within the work project, my role has been less experimental and more technical, focused on the market uptake of the product. Today, we're going to delve into my topic of research, which is the social aspects within sustainability, focusing on understanding what are we talking about when we talk about social impacts, and why it is important to account for them, how to do so, and the specificities that this accounting has for the safe and sustainable by design framework. So let's start with a question. What is social sustainability? To answer this question, we should go back to the definition of sustainable development provided in the 1987 report commissioned by the United Nations, or Common Future, also known as the Brundtland Report. Sustainable development should accomplish the fulfillment of the present generation's needs without compromising the future generations to meet their own needs. But what are these needs? Well, they should be to breathe clean air, to drink drinkable water, which is not polluted, to have access to nutritious food, to live without constant fear of extreme weather episodes. But I'm sure these are the kind of needs that you have probably thought about. However, when talking about sustainable development, we often forget about other kind of needs, those that relate to the social nature of humans. Sustainable development, as were reflected by the Sustainable Development Goals, should support universal access to education, protection against discrimination of any kind, and banning on child and forced labor. It should grant fair salaries for the workforce, access to electricity and internet for everybody, and it should support the integration of marginalized groups. These are what all we consider when we talked about social sustainability within sustainable development. These groups of people are what in social and economic science are known as stakeholders. A stakeholder is a group that have interest or a stake in a business. This concept appears opposing to the traditional shareholder. Shareholder would be a person that would only care, or people that only care about the monetary return from a company, so the return on investment, without having the interest in knowing how was return generated or who was involved and with conditions were them involved in the generation of this return, monetary return, as long as it is maximized and linearly. So these are the 6 categories that the United Nations Environmental Programme consider as main stakeholders to take into account when studying a product's social dimension. However, there could be many others, as the government or lobbies, for example. One way of classifying them is according to the salience model. This model uses 3 dimensions to classify the stakeholders. A stakeholder with power, for example, a governmental agency that can grant or revoke permits, can make things happen because they have the power to do so. Stakeholder with legitimacy, such as local residents or local organizations concerned for pollutions, have a rightful claim that deserves to be heard, to have attention. Finally, a stakeholder with urgency, like an NGO warning that toxic waste is leaking into a river, need action now, so it needs urgent action. When a stakeholder has all of the 3 dimensions, like the important dimensions, for instance, a regulatory authority responding to an active environmental complaint, they are the most salient. And the organization usually prioritizes them and their stakes, or should prioritize them and their stakes. Knowing a bit about the interested parties now, let's move on to see what is to be accounted for. According to the United Nations Environmental Programme, this is a non-exhaustive list of the social topics that can be included in the social assessment, classified by a stakeholder group. As you can see, topics as diverse as wealth distribution, privacy, end-of-life responsibility, or social corruption are included in the assessment. The question now is how to account for them. Here is when the social life cycle assessment comes in. social life cycle assessment is a methodology that studies the social impacts of a product that are caused throughout its life cycle. It is based on the environmental life cycle assessment, although it is still underdeveloped compared to the environmental counterpart. Nevertheless, in 2024, there was an ISO norm on social life cycle assessment, paving the way towards a normalized assessment. However, it is still kind of being developed. As shown here, the process flows through 4 different stages. Firstly, the goal and scope definition, where we identify the stakeholders to be involved and the social categories and subcategories to be considered in the assessment regarding the product that we are trying to study. Secondly, we have the inventory building phase, which involves collecting and quantifying social data related to this product and this goal and scope and these stakeholders that we have already defined. Thirdly, the social impact assessment is the step in which these data are evaluated against a reference situation or a reference scale, or in reference to a causal pathway from the effect or the inventory to the effect to the impact in the long term. And finally, the results interpretation allows us to identify which are the social hotspots, to compare different alternatives in terms of social footprints, and to define potential improvements in the product eco-design. According to the ISO norm, there are 3 different types of assessment that can be conducted. Firstly, a preliminary inventory assessment, considering the inputs and the outputs of the product. This will entail studying where each of the raw material was coming from, or how many hours of work are involved in the production of that good, and would just be preliminary in the cases of products in a low technology readiness level. Secondly, a performance assessment that will imply analyzing the situation of the product and the organization in the context and in a static moment, in the context of other products or other sector of other companies in the same sector, or other companies in the same countries, or other substitutive products, to see how good the company and the product is doing compared to their counterparts. Finally, the most complex assessment method is the impact pathway method, which required to define proved causal relationships between the product system, the product under study, and the broader social effect that it may cause. For example, in the supply chain of cotton textiles, poor working conditions in spinning mills may lead to workers' stress and fatigue, which can, in result, turn into a decreased well-being and health deterioration in the broad population in that area. To end up with this presentation, let's see what are the implications that the social aspects have in the chemicals and materials development within the context of the safe and sustainable by design framework. So socioeconomic assessment is considered as part of the step 5 of the SSBD of the framework. And while it is still under development and quite general, the main outputs from its application shows that the social and economic topics are intertwined in their consideration in the framework, placing a special focus on the critical raw materials and their presence in the product under study and their supply chains. The framework revolves around the concept of social fairness and competitiveness, anticipating what the next decades on materials development will look like. So, if you're interested in learning more on social sustainability, please do not hesitate to contact me for a follow-up. And of course, if you are interested in the chemicals and materials development world, please continue with the rest of the lectures within this course. Thanks for watching.